Part 3, Chapter 13, Early Years of Being a Managing Director. Dad had a small scruffy piece of paper, roughly torn out of a shorthand notebook, and which was pinned to the wall of his workshop in pride of place by the entrance. The torn perforations were still affixed, and its curled edges would have given anyone the impression that this was just a scrap of paper because it looked insignificant in every way, entirely betraying the value of the solitary word which had been written upon it with a biro. Godot. Even the word itself wasn't easily intelligible, being comprised of a mashup of two words described elegantly in English to be a portmanteau of go and do, but go do was the mantra with which he aspired to live. It meant that if you wanted to achieve anything, then you simply got up and did it. And this was something which for his entire life he had found very hard to do. Mum would complain that there were many half-finished projects at home that Dad would start but never finish, and this really irritated her, and I think that it irritated him too. Projects like the jumble of cables behind the TV in the living room, which had been part of his unfinished plan to route all video cables to the 3 bedrooms upstairs and also to his workshop, or the exposed trenches outside their home, which had been waiting for 3 years to be filled in with concrete in order to turn into foundations for a proposed new extension that Mum had dearly wanted. These were the same foundations onto which we would build our first apartment when I left university. This was go-do at work, and the word implied a value which Dad always admired in me. He may have used it as often as he did, perhaps because he believed the magic of its implied meaning might enter him somehow, causing him to procrastinate less. I love the famous Chinese proverb from the Tao Te Ching ascribed to Lao Tzu, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Now I had a major project to turn the company around, shed half of the existing people and employ new ones, design and implement a new strategic direction, and write a new business plan. I had to do this very quickly because the deadline for my thesis submission was less than 4 months away. I had worked very hard before, but now I worked like a man possessed, as there simply were not enough hours in the day to write my thesis in the spare time that I had. It also didn't help that our busy season started in September, which coincided with an annual video convention in Amsterdam which we always attended called IBC, and would lose me a very valuable weekend. So I trained myself to survive on just 6 hours sleep, and now woke an hour earlier at 5 a.m. and went to bed an hour later at 11 p.m. in order to give me a fighting chance of squeezing everything in. Reading my thesis all of these years later, I wrote that 2002 has been chosen to be the year that VMI will have an option of being sold and the 3 directors going their separate ways. Shares will be split 3 ways, in the ratio 35-35-30. It has been discussed that in order to retire comfortably, my parents will require a lump sum of £900,000 in 6 years. This is equivalent to an annuity paying £50,000 per year for life, increasing at 2% per year, Prudential estimate. The inclusion of my shares and admin costs of selling the business have been implied at 10%, calculates an implied value of £1.4 million. Since our accountants had valued VMI back in 1995 to only be worth around £250,000, and most of this value had been due to the increase in value of its freehold building, my goal became to increase VMI's value by 560% in just 6 years, and then selling it. This would be a tough challenge by any measure, but Dad didn't make this any easier for me. My new title of Managing Director didn't help me to make decisions much quicker than before, since every piece of marketing material that I would design and each new appointee that I would interview would need to be critically scrutinized by him. I often didn't agree with him either, and when neither of us backed down, this made for some really unpleasant times. We made progress nonetheless, and 1995 saw rapid growth in the company as we invested in more of the latest Avid computer-based editing systems, which were starting to become popular, and continued to increase our rental camera inventory to keep up with growing demand. Crucially, though, We needed both a new strategic direction and to simultaneously reposition ourselves from cheap and cheerful also-ran into a rental company with a real USP, unique selling point, something which is very hard to achieve. I first heard the news at the IBC Broadcast Equipment Convention in September 1995 that both Sony and Panasonic were planning to launch entirely new digital formats the following year. I realised that this would revolutionise TV production and provide the key to the new rebrand that I was looking for the company. The timing was perfect. At this exhibition, Sony had announced that they would be introducing a new digital format called DV Cam for release in 1996. My business plan would feature a major investment of these cameras, and my idea was to approach Sony directly and persuade them to agree to a VMI-Sony joint marketing proposal which would both improve our market positioning and also help Sony increase awareness of their new technology. Then, when the equipment landed in late 2006, with Sony's help of early allocation and preferential pricing, we would be ready to capitalize on it. It was a gutsy move, but I felt that the timing was right, though I needed to improve so many things at the same time and also persuade a major manufacturer to work with us that success was by no means assured. The market research which I had completed for my thesis had confirmed that staff, quality control, presentation and a good range of equipment were critical success factors when people choose a rental company, and I was acutely aware that at the time VMI was weak in every one of these areas. I pulled it off though, and submitted my thesis, graduating with an MBA in early 1996 at a ceremony held at the Albert Hall, and then in April that year visited LA for the biggest annual international convention called NAB, where I would present my marketing plan. Visiting NAB for the first time, I had prepared a fully comprehensive business proposal for Sony to consider, so that VMI would be given early allocation to buy £250,000 of the latest new digital equipment. In return, Sony would engage in a joint marketing campaign with VMI to launch this new format. A fully costed marketing campaign included posting full-page ads in all of the colour broadcast journals and also booking the Planet Hollywood restaurant in London for an entire day of presentations. I estimated that the marketing alone would cost £40,000 and had asked Sony to contribute £20,000 of this. Just in case they said no, I had also prepared an identical proposal for Panasonic, replacing the words Sony with Panasonic and DV Cam with DVC Pro, which was their version of the same format. VMI at the time was a complete nobody in the market, and I was really nervous when I gave my presentations. But incredibly, both Sony and Panasonic accepted my proposal, so I committed to working with Sony, and the plan was put into motion. Everything went like clockwork that year, which included another rebranding of VMI, employing a new team, and implementing new measures and procedures to help increase our quality standards. While this was happening, I also employed a new person to manage the DV Cam marketing plan, and surprisingly everything went to plan, and the launch event, which was held at the Planet Hollywood restaurant in October, was a roaring success, with 400 industry visitors attending. As is common with new equipment launches, delivery dates for the new equipment were pushed further and further back, and now, having launched these brand new professional cameras, clients rang us on a daily basis to hire them, but Sony could not confirm a delivery schedule. October became November, then December. In fact, the cameras wouldn't be fully available to hire until late January 1997, which coincided with the only Japanese factory which manufactured the new DV Cam tapes burning down. So in fact, the format wasn't properly available to use until April 1997, some 6 months after my event. This could have been a disaster, but an unintended consequence of my marketing was that I had managed to reposition VMI to be the premier London rental company to stock the new small digital cameras for hire, which used the consumer version of the DV Cam format, now called DV. Sony's new DV camera was a hit with everyone, from MTV to the BBC, and overnight everyone seemed to be using them. Our little company became the automatic rental company to call if you wanted to rent one. At just £3,000 a camera, we were buying these 5 at a time out of cash flow, They had a rapid payback of just a few months compared to the industry payback estimated to be over 2 years, according to my thesis. Before long, we had 30 of these in stock and were building a really profitable business, and revenue took off. The period from 1995 to 1999 saw the company generate £500,000 of clear net profit. Annual revenue would triple from £500,000 to £1.5 million a year in 1999, as the company had enjoyed 5 straight years of 26% compound growth and was now in the best shape that it had ever been in. The same period had seen us taking part in joint marketing initiatives with Sony, Panasonic, Avid, Canon and JVC, all of which had markedly increased the visibility of our brand as VMI's reputation grew. The company also won 3 industry awards, including Hire Company of the Year in 1998, Broadcast Hire Company of the Year in 1999, which is the only year it was run, and the NatWest Award for Good Business Practice in 1999. The edit business had also become quite strong, and by late 1999, VMI rented out some 20 Avid editing systems, and the edit business which Dad had started now included a second edit suite, employed 2 staff editors, and had its own branding of VMI Digital. Every year saw VMI becoming stronger, and this had not escaped the attention of its competitors. Suddenly, in 1998, 3 years ahead of the plan, a competitor approached VMI and made us an offer to buy the company outright for £1.5 million. The aim had been to sell the company for £1.4 million. But would the founding directors now honour their promise to sell? Sadly not. Chapter 14. It's Not Fair. Back in 1998 and 99, I wasn't even thinking about a trade sale for VMI. Things were much too busy and hectic at work. The company was growing and we operated a staff of about 20 people. We always seemed to be employing new people and building more divisions, so I was busy growing a management team to ensure that the firm could transition from one-man band to professional corporate entity. The company was now organised into 5 departments, including a rental desk, which took phone calls and rental bookings, camera floor, which prepared and returned the camera hires, Avid department, which hired out mobile computer-based edit systems, VMI Digital, which managed the 2 in-house edit suites, and also the accounts department. Each had its own head of department, and all were fairly young and inexperienced. We would occasionally meet all together at a management meeting which I would chair, and my parents, who didn't properly fit into any of these teams, would also attend. We still argued frequently, and this would sometimes happen in these meetings or in the office with others present, which was really embarrassing for me. Doors slamming, raised voices and tears would regularly punctuate the air, and it often didn't feel like I was working in a professional organisation at all. The hire department was still responsible for the majority of company revenue, and whilst I now had an assistant to help me take orders and a team of technicians preparing and returning hire orders, I was still involved in every major decision, and working with Dad continued to be difficult since I would do all of the work and the planning, and then he would criticise me. Mum was still very much involved in the day-to-day running of the company and took care of all the leases, paying the bills, looking after the staff and the housekeeping. She also helped to take some rental orders when it was really busy, and although she was not very organised, we supported each other and worked together well for most of the time. Dad was officially the chairman of the company, who spent much of his time sitting in his office. He helped to repair things which were damaged, gave the technicians some technical training, which was appreciated, but he adopted quality control to be his focus. This was one of the critical success factors that I had prioritised in my business plan. He spent much of his time checking kits which were ready to be collected and had a special quality checked stamp which he would use to stamp job sheets in order to demonstrate our commitment to excellence. I remember that he would inspect a kit and verify that every battery supplied was showing 5 bars of power, which meant that they were 100% charged. This was helpful, although he wouldn't check that essential cables were present if they hadn't been previously requested, so kits might still have errors even if they had passed his quality control. His intentions were always good, but he was never able to give me the support that I really needed, and our relationship was testy. The company worked well, but it was frantic, with constant firefighting and frayed nerves. Emergency deliveries were an everyday occurrence to rectify orders which had experienced issues, so as a result there was relentless stress at work. The business was continually changing and growing, and our technicians were not well trained because at the time the company didn't pay well, so staff retention was poor. This was another of my early errors, which we have happily rectified now. I remember that Golders Green was a really pressured place to work, and I'd be frequently inundated with demands from various members of staff who looked to me first to solve their issues. Every day I would receive calls from techs who couldn't find cameras on the shelves, or to notify me that essential accessories were damaged or incomplete, and I was expected to rectify this by magic. This was often because we had not put equipment away correctly, or due to untidiness, or not fully resolving previously incomplete returns. The company did work, but it never worked like a well-oiled machine, which was a source of considerable frustration for me. Cheryl recalls that every 6 months I would come home with my head in my hands and lament that I simply couldn't do this anymore, since I just didn't have the support at work that I needed. Then we would have a heart-to-heart talk, when she would helpfully suggest that I leave the company and start a career elsewhere. Every time, though, I would end up returning to VMI, like a wounded warrior returning into the throes of battle. At least that's how it felt to me. I did attempt to hire and train department heads to be able to autonomously run their departments, but my parents would continually undermine their authority and sabotage my efforts, so they never stayed for very long. So when we received our first offer to sell VMI back in 1998, and then amazingly a second offer a year later, my heart leapt, since this offered me the way out that I'd been working towards. This would be my freedom to do what I really wanted, and I could finally leave VMI. Immediately, Cheryl and I worked out our finances and decided that we needed a plan. Aware how important I still was to the firm, I assumed that I would need to commit to another 2 years to the company, since any buyer would expect this in any potential sale. My son Josh was also due to be born in September 1998, so we made the perhaps less obvious decision that we would become tax exiles for 2 years and tour Europe in a luxury caravan. We were so serious about this that we'd already selected and spec'd out our caravan, paying extra for air conditioning and bike rack options, and had even paid a deposit to reserve one so we could collect it once the company had been sold. However, this did rely on my parents agreeing to sell the company, and at the time it didn't occur to me that they might renege on their promise. On receiving the first offer to buy the company from an industry conglomerate, I attended the initial meeting and agreed basic terms, then reported back to my parents with the good news. You would have expected them to be happy. Videomania, in the 10 years before I had joined, had never made any profit or paid them well either. In fact, in 1998, the year that we received the first offer to buy the company, VMI was performing so well that it had generated 35 times the average level of profit of the 10 years before I had joined. This sale, just 3 years after I had become MD, would give them both an exit and a $50,000 a year guaranteed income for life. Yet they both looked very glum. Mum had been impressed by the company's stellar growth and expected that this would continue in the future, and wondered whether it was the right time to sell after all. She reasoned that if we waited just a few more years, then the company would be worth so much more, so her decision was that we should not accept this offer. Dad, however, countered with a phrase I will always remember. Barry, I have still so much to give. I'm just not ready to retire yet. It was extremely clear that they would not sell. Not now, not ever. With just a third of the shareholding, I had no power to make this happen, so I had no choice but to return. So return I did. When the second offer to buy the company was received in 1999, it was met with the same response. It seemed that I was the goose which proverbially laid the golden egg, and they had no intention of setting me free. At this time in my career, I couldn't put a foot wrong with the company, and whatever ideas I had, they seemed to be successful. Manufacturers liked my energy and originality, and the company had a growing reputation in the marketplace. Although VMI was still small, we were doing interesting things, and it continued to make money and grow, and I was the driver to all of this. I had another original idea too. Since I spent most of my time on the telephone in front of a computer, I deduced that if I couldn't leave VMI, then I might as well make a lifestyle decision to move out of London and run the company remotely. I would still have a telephone and a computer, just live somewhere pretty to bring up my son. You will guess that my parents would not support me in this decision either, and for this we would all pay a very hefty price. I later found out that the second offer that we'd received to buy VMI had come from a group who at the time also owned the UK's largest drama camera rental business, and which by some coincidence my later business partner Kevin was a director of. 3 years later, they messed up their business and promptly went into receivership, so perhaps in retrospect, selling was not the right decision for VMI after all, though at the time it definitely felt like the right one to me. I wouldn't be leaving VMI now and was about to embark on the hardest 10 years of my life. Chapter 15. A Lifestyle Choice. The new millennium was fast approaching, and I was impatient to start the next stage of my life. The 2000 financial year would see VMI's revenue increase by a massive 26%, which by some coincidence was the average rate of growth for the previous 6 years too, and by now we had fully established our edit facility VMI Digital into a proper going concern. It had been recently relocated from unfashionable Golders Green to its own building at a chic location in West London close to the BBC. The facility now had capability for expansion beyond the 2 main edit suites and was now under the expert management of Peter Zach, who had joined us a couple of years previously as a skilled editor. This new move was an excellent decision, since under Peter's management, the post-production business really flourished and continues to exist today as an independent edit facility called West Digital, which both Peter and his partner Darren still run. VMI had acquired a crewing division in 1999 by buying the goodwill of a company called Crystal Television, which had just closed down. This gave us a functioning filming department which managed 5 separate camera teams called crews, which were contracted to supply the Granada TV network with news footage for their primetime daily news programme 60 Minutes with Trevor McDonald. After acquisition, this illustrious contract transferred to VMI and was really important to us since the department shared much of our existing camera fleet, avoiding the need for us to buy too much equipment, and this increased our revenue markedly. For the first couple of years, it operated out of a different building, which was just a few miles away from us, and managed by 2 big characters, Margaret and David. The symbiotic relationship of VMI crews and VMI worked really well. At least it did to begin with. Our Avid department, which rented out the mobile edit suites, was run by another big character called Dado. My policy has always been to allow key members of staff to create their own job titles, and Dado became VMI's first and only Avid wizard. I remember interviewing Dado for the role, which involved working a lot of unsociable hours to perform installations and provide technical support. I asked him how he would cope with the workload, since, as I explained, the previous department head had frequently sent me emails at 3 a.m. to ensure that I knew that he was still working. Dado answered me confidently that he would ensure that the systems that were built by him were sufficiently reliable that he wouldn't receive calls at 3 a.m. because the systems wouldn't break down, and he was right. VMI's growing rental business continued to buy more cameras for its growing fleet, and every year saw new digital formats released by various manufacturers, and 2000 was no exception. Panasonic had announced that they planned to release the DVC Pro 50 format, and we considered this to be a brave move as they aimed to challenge Sony's digital Betacam format, which at the time was universally used in mainstream production. Manufacturers had to be very gentlemanly in their approach to marketing in the UK and felt that they couldn't make direct comparisons between technologies and equipment from different vendors, but I was independent and could be much freer in my approach. I proposed a very aggressive marketing proposal to Panasonic, which would include a strong graphic image of a pair of gloves with a DVC Pro 50 logo pitted against another with a digital Betacam logo, and this would be styled as a fight in a boxing ring with the words "You Decide" printed underneath. I plan to shoot blind tests of both formats and send these to chief engineers at the BBC, ITV and Channel 4, who of course would not be able to tell the difference between the formats and would have to report their conclusions confirming this. Panasonic gave me the green light, so the test shoot went ahead and the broadcast engineers wrote their reports. A big story about the comparison test appeared in a major industry journal, which included the engineers' statements confirming that they couldn't tell the formats apart, and this edition included full-page display adverts inviting visitors to my event. We hosted this at the Hard Rock Cafe, and it was well attended by key industry delegates who were able to scrutinise identical recordings from both formats, side by side on matched monitors. No one attending was in any doubt that DVC Pro 50 was indeed as good as Digital Betacam. It was great for VMI and Panasonic and kept developing VMI's reputation for being ahead of the curve and doing interesting things. My big move, however, was to find and employ a new manager to act as my second-in-command at the company, to allow them effectively to run VMI if I were to take a back seat. Once this person was installed and trained, I would be free to move out of London to start a new chapter in my life. It took me 3 months to find Warren, whom I was confident would be the perfect individual to run VMI in my absence. This would be a first for the company, so when he needed a company car, we bought him a new Mercedes, which was another first as well. It took me 6 full months to train him so that all of my systems could continue when I left. I worked hard and wrote an entire quality manual, which I bound and distributed to all staff and heads of departments of all of the processes and procedures for the company, so everyone would have access to a set of SOPs, standard operating procedures, to follow. This was a tremendously detailed document and included procedures of all company functions of all departments, from taking an order to raising an invoice, from raising a crew to returning an Avid system, and from performing a data import to making a daily backup. By now, I had promoted one of the client contacts to rental desk manager, and with the addition of the new crewing division, VMI was now a strong company with 6 independent departments. My goal was that with a structured management team in place and all activities proceduralized, including training and recruitment, I was now able to finally adopt a hands-off approach and run the company from a distance. It had always been a goal of ours to build our own house, and at last we had an opportunity to do so. We just needed to decide where our new home should be. Having been mostly privately educated, which had given me a great start, I planned this too for my son. At the time, a full private education cost around £200,000, but though most of the excellent state-run grammar schools had been closed during the 1980s, a few still remained in Lincolnshire and Kent and were as good as the best private schools. I found out later that there were also some remaining in Buckinghamshire, which would have suited us much better than Kent, but we stupidly ignored these. We realised that if we moved to an area which was within the catchment area of a top grammar school, then we could live in a beautiful rural place and send our son to be educated at a top grammar school, and it wouldn't cost us a penny. We'd ruled out Lincolnshire early on as being too flat, and so decided on Kent. I held on to an early idea that I wanted to live on a hill in order to avoid the risk of flooding, which was quite prescient for the time. We took a map of Kent and drew a red ring around all the towns, which included a top 100 grammar school, and spent an entire weekend visiting every one so that we could decide where we wanted to live, and in doing so, shortlisted Tunbridge and Cranbrook before settling on Cranbrook. Now we needed to find a plot. However, these only came up rarely for sale, since UK building restrictions made building new custom houses a rare event. However, I was never one to be worried about a challenge, so we searched and eventually found a plot for sale in Benenden, which was within the grammar school catchment area. When we visited it, however, it proved to be disappointing, quite expensive, and borderline not cost-effective. We were so desperate to move, though, that we decided to make an offer anyway. On walking to the estate agent to make our formal offer, we happened to glance at the window of another estate agent on the same road and noticed the details of the house that we now live in. Again, the property wasn't ideal, but we saw tremendous opportunity of the house that it could become. We viewed it that afternoon and I made an offer which was immediately accepted, and the following week we accepted an offer to sell our own house. The sale went through really quickly. We agreed to complete and moved in just 8 weeks later. What possibly could go wrong? Chapter 16. Fast Food for Cows. I've always had a lot of ideas, and often tell people that I have around 20 original ideas per day, at which point my co-director Kevin retorts that usually 18 of them are rubbish. He's quite right, of course, but you have to have new ideas first in order to spot the ones with real potential to change the world. I once read that nirvana is the feeling that you have between having a great idea and discovering what's wrong with it. I don't remember who said this, but it resonates very well with me. Dad and I would relish challenging conventional thinking and discovering new ways of doing things which hadn't been considered before. Our home in Kent overlooks a field which is rented by a local farmer. When we first moved here, Josh, aged 2, would come down to breakfast each morning and always say good morning to the sheep, who at the time lived in the field. Then for many years the field lay fallow, until one day we received a letter from the landowner informing us that he now planned to keep stock in the field. Coming from a corporate background, I was horrified to picture pallets and crates spoiling our view, so when I called him, this was received with laughter, as the owner answered that obviously he'd meant livestock. We would soon have cows living in the field. Over the next 10 years, we became quite used to seeing cows from our home, and then one day I had a unique idea. People like fast food, so what about cows? Cows have 3 stomachs and a specially adapted digestive system to be able to survive on an exclusively grass diet, ruminating for hours, chewing the cud, and enabling them to digest cellulose-based food. I wondered whether grass clippings could be their version of fast food. I tried to persuade them to eat the clippings from my lawnmower, and to begin with, they were deeply suspicious and were frankly very slow learners. Eventually, though, one cow finally understood and tasted what I'd been trying to persuade them to eat. From the gusto with which she tucked into the grass, it was clear that she preferred the clippings of the choicest, fresh new growth from my neat lawn, rather than the rough weeds and mature woody growth of the poorly tended field. The other 6 cows soon joined in, and in a very short time all were heartily eating the lawnmower clippings that I had provided for them. Each time thereafter that I cut my lawn, I would throw my clippings into the field next to my home, and in a short time the cows would come running, literally, to my wooden fence to eat this tasty treat. It didn't take them long for them to associate the noise made by my petrol-powered mower with the promise of a tasty snack, so in true Pavlovian spirit, as soon as I would start the engine of my mower, began a cacophony of mooing which could be heard from the field next to my garden. Unfortunately, they didn't distinguish between the sounds of my mower and those of our neighbours' mowers, so each time anyone in the vicinity would cut their grass, the cows would all simultaneously start loud, synchronized mooing until they were fed. I then instructed all of my neighbours to tip their clippings into the field adjacent to my home in order to keep the cows happy, which they were only too happy to do. Then, one day, the farmer who rented this field moved the cows to a new location, and though I never found out where this was, I did sometimes ponder on how quizzical their new neighbours must have been when upon mowing their grass they would suddenly hear the loud mooing music of the cows which used to live next door to us. Chapter 17. A Horrible Year. I recall a joke which depicts a man standing on a volcano which is showing clear signs that it will explode very soon. 3 cars stop to offer him a lift as they evacuate to a safer place, but he politely declines, claiming that God will save him. A military vehicle also stops and requests, rather more forcefully, that he join them to escape, but once again he declines their offer. Lastly, a helicopter, scouring the area for potential evacuees, pleads that he must join them or he will surely be killed, though as before he once again insists that God will save him and remains standing on the now very angry volcano. The volcano explodes and inevitably he dies, after which he rises to the pearly gates of heaven, where he is greeted by St. Peter and God. He implores to God, "Where were you in my hour of need?" God replies, "I sent you 3 cars, a military vehicle and a helicopter. What more did you expect?" I dwell on this apocryphal story as Cheryl and I were about to leave our home in very convenient Hertfordshire, which was situated just a 20-minute drive to work, and where we were also close to friends and family. Our plan was to move 100 miles away to a rural idyll, but which would instead require a 2.5-hour commute each way to work by car, train and tube. It was a poor decision, driven perhaps by a well-considered strategy, but one that was both fundamentally flawed, and although we both had our own personal doubts about the plan, we did not choose to share them with each other. We were running away from the company and my family, since I felt trapped, and despite working extremely hard, could not see a way out, so the Kent plan was put into motion. What resulted over the next 12 months was interdepartmental war and the business spiralling to near bankruptcy. In the 2 years from 1999 to 2001, whilst revenue rose by an impressive £700,000 to almost £2.2 million, the overhead would outstrip this and increase by £900,000. After 11 straight years of profitability until 2001, this was now the start of 10 years of financial distress, and our bottom line changed from showing a net profit of £145,000 in 1999 to declaring a net loss of £60,000 in 2001. The business aphorism, turnover is vanity, bottom line is sanity, and cash is reality is very poignant here, since when a business runs out of cash it goes bust. Our small net loss was nowhere near as bad as how appalling our cash flow had become, and during the next 12 months, VMI changed from being a cash-positive operation to one which burned £400,000 of cash per year. By mid-2001, VMI was fighting for its survival for the first time on my watch. It started so well when we moved to warm and sunny Kent in May 2000, when the gardens and meadows were bursting into bloom. In case you aren't familiar with the English county of Kent, it is appropriately described as the Garden of England, and spring is my favourite time of the year. Our home is situated in the middle of the Weald of Kent, which is a green area of unspoilt beauty, which, because of its absence of fast roads and people, we discovered is also a really inconvenient place to live, certainly when you've been used to London. To put this into context, our home is about 10 miles from the nearest dual carriageway, 5 miles from the nearest traffic light, and 10 miles from the nearest railway station. We live in a holiday region, and for much of that first year we felt that we were taking our first well-earned holiday in the 10 years of frenetic working in order to turn my parents' business around. I wasn't concerned though, since I believed that I had an effective management structure in place, a solid business, and a general manager to hold things together. Even before I left, the cracks started showing, but I was assiduously ignoring them, relying instead on my hopeless optimism that everything would be all right, just like Helmslow's exchange in the 1998 film Shakespeare in Love. How will it turn out? Strangely enough, it all turns out well. How? I don't know. It is a mystery. The first senior post to depart was my GM, Warren, and though it had taken me 3 months to find him and 6 months to train him, Dad could not help himself in undermining his authority, and he felt that his position had become untenable. Just a few weeks before I was about to move, he left his new Mercedes parked outside the building, put the keys through the letterbox, and I never saw him again. Knowing that Warren would now not hold things together when I left at this critical time, I still had time to change my plans and not move to Kent. This would once more see me putting the company before myself, as I'd done so many times before, but this time I was determined to put my family first, though unwisely I didn't share my fears with Cheryl and doggedly stuck to the plan. Another of my character flaws at the time was never to turn back, and I'm reminded of Marty McFly's experiences in the Back to the Future film trilogy, where he could never stand being called Chicken. As a result, when he was inevitably goaded by someone who does call him Chicken, he very nearly ruins his entire future before changing his mind, and the film has a happy ending. I see now that my stubbornness resulted in our decision to move to Kent, whatever the consequences. Despite private reservations, we moved, and for a time I took a complete back seat with my job and let my management team run the company, relying on the training, systems and procedures that I had implemented. However, I neglected to factor my parents into the plan. All departments continued to be really busy in early 2000 as the business continued to grow, but in my absence, a state of anarchy had taken hold. The department heads now treated their divisions more like fiefdoms, jealously protecting them and refusing to cooperate with one another in order to share equipment, staff and resources, which had previously been our strength. Management meetings were now very rare, and when they did happen, were dysfunctional. Action plans were not followed through, and managers not held to account. When the techs couldn't find cameras and radio mics on the shelves to prepare for the hires, the operations manager blamed the crewing department. Instead of resolving the issues, they reserved the missing equipment into a holding order to solve another day, but in doing so reduced our quantity of cameras that we could hire out. Despite Chow in the accounts department continually yelling that we were spending more on buying tape stock consumables than we were generating in sales revenue, no one listened to him. Only much later did I discover that during this time some £180,000 of cameras, radio mics and tapes were actually being stolen from the company, and this was by managers. Staff left and morale dropped to an all-time low, and inevitably profitability and cash flow plummeted. I had been the glue that had previously held everything together, and now that I was gone, the mice gaily played. Oh, and did they play! Also, our management accounts at the time took some months to prepare, and our financial reporting was very basic, so I wasn't to learn the depth of the problems until some months later, during which the situation became even worse. Mum would call me up on a daily basis, sobbing on the phone about how terrible things were, and I was reminded of the crying telephone calls that we'd shared whilst I was at university. This really stung, since in my mind she had been the cause of this unpleasant situation, but the truth of the matter was that since I was now the managing director, I alone had created the problem, so now I had to fix it. By autumn 2000, I resumed going to work once per week, embarking on the grinding 5-hour daily commute, and soon this turned into 2 days. Once the full extent of the problem became clear, this became 3, 4, and finally 5 days a week. Profitability was to plummet to the worst it had ever been, and this coincided with an increase in lease repayments for a new fleet of vehicles and equipment which had been specifically purchased for the crewing department, and cash now hemorrhaged from the company. I persevered with my long daily commutes to stabilise the firm, but weak management and loose cost controls meant that in spite of good revenues we were about to endure 6 straight loss-making years as we entered the 2000s. Discord between the company and Margaret and David, who ran the crewing division, meant that they decided to leave the company in 2003. Their departure was a major loss to us because they had been the key to retaining the major filming business, and without them we inevitably lost the Granada contract, and without that the department was no longer financially viable and resulted in its ultimate closure the following year. I also fired the operations manager, whom I had held responsible for the thefts and losses, and whilst things stabilised, revenue continued to decline into the mid-2000s. Saving the company had become my sole focus. You may be interested to learn that by now my parents had realised their error, and together we did actually try to sell the company. We even instructed a company to represent us to potential buyers. Sadly, this was a forlorn quest, since by now no one was interested in buying us and these efforts came to nothing. It was not all bad though, since I left work each day at 3 p.m. so I could be home for dinner, and experienced all of the milestones of my young son growing up. I asked a very young Josh what sound a cat made, and he replied meow. Then likewise a cow, and he replied moo. I subsequently pointed to a red chair and asked him what colour is it. His face broke into a huge smile and he answered proudly, blue! I realised that aged just 15 months he had no concept of what cow and colour actually meant. So now I decided to play a game with him and started teaching him the capitals of the world. We started with England, London, France, Paris. Then when we ran out of European nations, we went on to Asia, Kazakhstan, Astana, Uzbekistan, Tashkent, etc. By the end of a few months, he could recite the capitals of more than 100 countries, but obviously forgot them as quickly as he'd learnt them, but it was fun whilst it lasted. To ensure that my shorter days were as productive as possible, I was able to work on the train using my laptop, and this extended my working day by 2 hours. My efforts to make the company more efficient resulted in implementing huge cost reduction measures to reverse the downward spiral. But however much I tried, profitable trading always seemed to be tantalizingly close, but elude us nonetheless. On a positive note, staff morale improved over time, and we achieved the coveted Investors in People standard in 2001, reflecting the advances that we'd made to being a good employer. The Bassett triumvirate still didn't work well, and the stressful and challenging business environment made things harder still. Our industry was changing very quickly, and this was impeding our recovery. As digital equipment had become the norm, our clients were now buying the cheap cameras that we specialised in, rather than always renting them, and our competitors were buying them too. This was to increase competition, reflecting in lower hire rates and resulting in steadily falling turnover. I'm sure that everyone was regretting not having sold VMI back in 1999, but there was no going back now. It was time for a new strategy, or going bust. Chapter 18. A lie is a lie is a lie. I am brutally honest and want to stress that this isn't necessarily the easiest way to live your life, but I have made it my own. A few years ago, I was in my local pub after having played a game of village cricket when an interesting question was posed. We imagined a situation where our wives tried on a new outfit which they liked, but which we felt wasn't very flattering. The question from our wives was, "Does my bum look big in this?" And we wanted to know how we might answer this bombshell of a question. I was really surprised when every one of my teammates responded without hesitation that in spite of thinking otherwise, they would tell their wives that they thought the outfit looked lovely. I found this strange and answered that whilst Cheryl has a lovely slim figure, I thought that she would want to know the truth in such a situation, so of course I would tell her so, though perhaps not in such a blunt way. An apocryphal story also comes to mind of a parishioner who asked his vicar whether a white lie to his mother-in-law was acceptable if he told her that his lunch had been enjoyable when clearly it was not. His vicar replied that a lie was a lie was a lie, and that if he'd been more honest about his mother-in-law's cooking, then perhaps her cooking would have improved and he would have had an enjoyable lunch. I agree with him. Back to 1999. When we had agreed to take over Crystal Television's crewing business, we hadn't actually purchased the going concern of the division. Their company had ceased to trade, and we'd subsequently employed the staff and freelancers who worked on this production and invoiced directly to Granada TV. Even though it wasn't in the previous managing director's gift to sell us the contract, we had made a handshake deal with him, and when VMI took over the contract and previous Crystal TV staff, we would, over time, pay both Margaret David and himself a combined £50,000. It had been a handshake deal, but this agreement was never formally put into writing. I had had every intention of honouring this promise, since it had been made in good faith, though my parents were in no hurry to formalise this arrangement. At first, VMI was suffering from growing pains, and later on had other things to think about, such as surviving as a business, so it never became a high priority to formalise this. We regularly met with Mr. Crystal MD and the Margaret David team, who now ran the VMI crewing division, to discuss how the contract and operation were going. Every time the subject of the written contract and goodwill payment came up, my parents would obfuscate and promise that we would soon finalise the deal and commence paying the agreed sum, just not right now. Whilst my parents were content with kicking this can down the road, I was not, and felt really embarrassed by their conduct. So, when my parents were on holiday during the summer of 2000, I drew up a legal contract committing VMI to pay the £50,000 over 2 years to the three of them in order to formalise our handshake commitment. Having made several of these agreements in the past, due diligence ensured that what I had written and signed was now legally binding. Consequently, upon returning from their holiday, My parents were furious that I had written and signed this contract without consulting them. We continued to make the agreed goodwill payments over time, in spite of Margaret and David emigrating to the US, losing us the contract with Granada, and VMI going into a financial spiral. I kept to our word, and over the next 2 years we paid the $50,000 in full, since I believe that all promises are to be kept. Chapter 19. I See the Future. By 2003, I was looking for a new strategy, and once again at the annual NAB TV convention in Las Vegas, I was ready to ride the next big innovation wave which would shape the future of TV production. A little TV history is important here, since big changes were coming. The very first TV design had just 30 vertical lines of resolution and used a really small screen, which is hard to believe now. When the BBC introduced a 405-line standard in 1936, this was originally marketed as high definition. The next innovation in the early 1970s increased this to 625 lines resolution and was also marketed originally as HD, though now we call it standard definition or SD-PAL. It was inevitable that the next increment to 1080 lines resolution would also be called HD, and so it was. By 2003, although VMI had become the main UK rental company specialising in low-end DV-type cameras, we were no longer winning the profitable long hires that we had before, due to a combination of increased competition and also because our clients were now buying these cameras themselves. Since the equipment was also becoming cheaper, I realised that the long-term future of the company was now in jeopardy. I decided that the strategic direction of the company needed to change to embrace the new HD equipment, which seemed to be just on the horizon. This looked to be a perfect fit for us, since the equipment was expensive, which provided good barriers to entry for both our competitors and clients, and I had an aptitude for the creative flair required to market it. Sony had introduced their HD format and first HD camera just a few years before, but their first model had been large and expensive, with each camera costing more than £70,000, so it was not widely used. You might be interested to learn that George Lucas insisted that Star Wars Episode I was shot with this camera, but at the time this was very rare indeed. Sony recognized the limitations of their earlier camera and had just announced that they planned to release a new HD camera which would be both smaller and lighter than the original and might help to make shooting HD more popular too. While each camera would still cost £50,000 each, this would be more affordable than the original model, although the accessories to make a shooting kit would still cost another £50,000, plus another £50,000 on top for lenses. I felt, though, that with some innovative marketing, I could steal a win on all of my competitors who may have bought the original expensive model, and in doing so, reposition VMI as the premier HD rental company in the UK. Once again, I updated and rewrote my annual business plan, something which I continue to do today, and calculated that as a consequence of our recently run-off leases and improved cost controls, we could immediately afford to invest in £250,000 of new equipment. This might seem like a brave move, since nobody at the time was asking for HD, but I believed that in time viewers would want to watch all programmes in this new format, thus compelling producers to shoot their programmes in HD. They just needed a bit of persuading first. Once again, I wrote a comprehensive marketing plan, which I planned to present to Sony at NAB 2003, and which would include advertising and promotion. It even included booking the Sounds nightclub for an all-day event of presentations and writing a booklet bravely entitled HD for Producers, All You Need to Know. I say bravely, since I first needed to learn the theory myself. Sony agreed to my plan, and I recall one meeting when we were designing the booklet, which was attended by two Sony executives who pored over the work that I'd done so far. I remember them frowning as they considered some of my word choices, making helpful suggestions for alternative adjectives such as replacing cheap with competitive. They explained that Sony HD equipment could never be described as being cheap. Having received Sony's blessing, we committed to an initial £250,000 investment and ordered 4 of the brand new Sony HD cameras. The marketing plan went like a dream, And once again, over 400 delegates from the TV industry attended our major launch event. When the huge, high-definition images were projected for the first time, there was a total hush from the audience, since they'd never before experienced such quality. The lack of grain and size of the high-quality images made this an entirely new experience, and HD would become an instant success. I then had a frantic 6 months, visiting all of the top production companies in London to make individual presentations to their most senior producers and introducing them all to the concepts and arguments of shooting in HD. Each time I would bring an HD player, HD projector and portable screen with me, as well as my HD reel, so I could show them large images and make the cogent argument that since they owned the residual rights to their productions, then shooting in HD would be in their financial interest too. I explained that at some point in the future, HD would quickly become the norm, and when this did happen, any previous programs mastered in SD would lose all value. I reminded them that since they owned the residual program rights to their productions, they would quickly be worse off if they continued to shoot today in standard definition, SD. The penny dropped, and they immediately switched their productions to HD. And since VMI was one of the few rental companies which stocked this equipment, and specifically the new camera model in any quantity, we mopped up. This made an immediate impact to VMI's finances, since HD camera revenue didn't crowd out any of our existing small camera income. Once again, we were back in the game. I persuaded the BBC to let me supply HD cameras to shoot a Holby City pilot. I visited BBC Elstree to supply HD cameras and allow them to shoot the spoof episode which depicted a surgeon discovering all kinds of extra organs and surgical instruments inside a patient that they'd been operating on. They liked the idea of shooting in HD, but we were punching too far above our weight at the time for us to be considered to win a prestigious series like this, and we would never supply this series with HD cameras in the future. I also had my sights set on the BBC's Doctor Who series, which had recently restarted shooting after a 20-year break, but was still being made in SD. I tried so hard to persuade them to switch to HD, explaining about future-proofing the production, but at the time, the producer was simply not interested. I remember another producer telling me that if HD didn't look like Super 16 film, then flatly they were not interested. Of course HD would not look like film, I answered, since it doesn't have the visible grain that Super 16 has, and instead has a new look, which is filmic, yet high resolution and clean. This would become the look of the future. And whilst they too were not interested in what I had to say at the time, the next 5 years would see all productions switching to HD. The following 12 months into 2004 would see company revenues rising by an impressive 19%, reversing the trend of our recently shrinking revenue, and which was confirmation of the decision to invest in HD. Nonetheless, the costs of such a major investment had a substantially detrimental effect to our finances, and we made the largest loss to date for 2004. I didn't mind, as we were again investing in the future. Chapter 20. The Power of a Smile. Travelling on mainline trains during the rush hour takes a bit of getting used to. Passengers catch the same trains every day, travelling on the same carriage, and most of them even sit in the same seat and become cross if they find someone else sitting on it. The London network is really busy, and delays are fairly common, so any delay quickly raises their stress level. This helps to explain why people feel pressured when they arrive at their terminus, and are herded through the ticket barriers, greeted by stony-faced train operatives. I thought that these train operatives might be miserable as a consequence of the passengers having a grim disposition themselves, since I noticed that passengers only rarely smiled at each other. I had an idea that I might be able to break this cycle, so I tried an experiment. For a week, I smiled at the train operatives every time I saw them. I learned their names, and noticed and complimented them when they had a new hairstyle. And do you know what? They all began smiling whenever they saw me. This worked with everyone who worked at Charing Cross Station, except one, and his name was Addy. Addy was a dour ticket collector, and he seemed immune to my smile therapy, which did not seem to have any impact on his demeanour. By now, I travelled with a fold-up bicycle, choosing to ride the final part of my journey to work by bicycle instead of underground. This meant that I needed to walk through the manual gate, which was often operated by Addie, who made a point of ignoring the passengers and would not take my ticket from me when I walked through the gate. Travelling on a bike, I had no pockets in my cycle jacket, so nowhere to store my ticket, and despite trying, Addie continually refused to take my ticket from me. Not a big deal, but just a bit irritating for me. One day, I decided that he would take my ticket, so I stopped walking in the middle of the gate and offered him my ticket. "That's okay," he said. "You have it." "No, thank you," I replied. "I have no pockets. Please take it from me." This time, he lifted his hands as if surrendering. Actually, had a smile. He was enjoying this. "It's fine. You keep it." I would not back down. "Please take my ticket," I said a little more firmly. By now, there was a queue of people behind me, waiting for me to clear the gate so that they too could get to work. But I was not going to back down now. I waited for his next move with my ticket in my outstretched hand. He was having none of it. "I insist," he said. "You keep it." I tried to put it in the breast pocket of his uniform, but he went nuts and wriggled like a swarm of ants were inside his shirt, so I deftly placed my ticket onto his shoulder and quickly walked away with him shouting at me. I had won the first round. A few weeks passed before I saw Addie again, and when I did, I had young Josh with me. We had visited London together and were sat on a train waiting for it to depart so that we could return home. Out of the corner of my eye, I recognised Addie flanked by 2 policemen walking towards my carriage. I saw them stop outside the window that we were sitting adjacent to and noticed him pointing at me. The policeman then boarded the train and approached me. At this point I was really surprised. This had never happened to me before. They asked me to come with them. I obviously told them no, since the train was about to leave, but they informed me that I would not be catching this train. They explained that an allegation had been made against me of an assault charge, which had to be investigated. An assault charge? That's ridiculous! Anyway, I left the train, and after explaining to them what had actually happened a few weeks before, was allowed to catch the next train home with a caution. But I was determined that this incident would not spoil my smiling experiment. I was to see Addie plenty more times that season, and each time I did, I continued to smile at him, and in time too, he began to smile back. Then one time on my way home, he saw me and unexpectedly grabbed me and proceeded to hug me, and even told another passenger that I was his best friend. We even took a selfie together. It proved that I was right, and a smile had very special properties to make everything and everyone better. And it's free as well. Chapter 21. Overcooking It. Visiting Vegas for the annual NAB TV conference, it is interesting to see the different strategies that gamblers adopt when they play in the casinos. When they are confident that they have a strong hand, seasoned players increase their bets as they believe that the odds are in their favour and then hold back on their betting when they're less sure. Business strategy is a bit like this, and timing is everything. You want to be the first up the hill, but you don't want to meet a live dragon when you arrive, else you would have made sure to bring a fireproof suit with you. In 2003, VMI's HD strategy was going great guns. Revenue was up nearly 20% in 2004 in spite of increased competition from another rental company for Avid editing systems. Our competitors' large fleet of Avid systems and deliberately low hire rates meant that it became scarcely profitable for us to compete, and we would close this division in 2006. Hindsight would show us that this competitor's low pricing strategy would backfire for them too, and they would go bust themselves in a few years' time. In 2003, VMI had cornered the market for HD camera hire, as many of its competitors had bought the earlier, more expensive and heavier HD cameras that their clients no longer wanted, and our marketing was paying off handsomely. We were winning lots of repeat customers too many in fact, so my problem became lack of availability, since 4 cameras were simply not enough to service the amount of work that we were winning. I was also out 2 days a week visiting clients in the West End, and each time I would take my HD projector, HD player and screen with me, and this was very hard work. My new idea was to build a Soho branch for sales and marketing, incorporating an HD screening room, complete with proper rate cinema seating, allowing me to make regular presentations about the merits of shooting in HD. I calculated that we could easily afford the costs of running this extravagant facility with the revenue generated by additional demand that it would create, and this would allow us to fund increasing our camera fleet from 4 kits to 10. We found a building in Darblay Street, Soho, and rented 2 floors. We built a reception and office on the ground floor and actually built a 19-seat HD screening theatre in the basement. It was fitted out with seats ripped out from a Disney screening room and installed with an HD projector with a 3.83-metre screen, video server and a massive sound system. It looked really smart and much more impressive than our Golders Green building, and I remember that it had big floor-to-ceiling smoked glass in the reception too. More practically, we upgraded the telephone system with a new IT infrastructure, which would allow us all to work remotely from this new office, and this was a useful precursor to the remote working systems which we would implement in the future too. Having our own screening room meant that I could now present HD for Producers presentations to prospective clients whenever I wanted to. I even managed to persuade Sony's media department, which manufactured HD tape stock, to pay for a colour folder for us to give to people with handout notes, which was branded both VMI and Sony Media. I gave my HD for Producers presentations on a regular weekly slot, and usually around a dozen people attended. Many would become clients, so this worked very well. HD was really taking off in 2004, and we'd won so many productions from the BBC and independent producers that our limited inventory couldn't keep up with demand. We bought an extra £200,000 worth of cameras in early 2004, and then, when strong demand continued, another £500,000 later that year. For a small company, this was a considerable investment. We could not sustain such high lease payments for all of these cameras at the time, so we worked with a major dealer to purchase this on our behalf and agreed on an extended rent-to-buy arrangement. To make it easier for us, we also agreed a 6-month deferral so that we would not initially pay for these new cameras until the business could sustain it. This was a bit like enjoying a winning streak at cards and then taking all the winnings and doubling the bet. It would end badly. 2 things happened which caused the company considerable pain over the next few years. Firstly, in order to make HD equipment more mainstream, both Sony and Panasonic had suddenly reduced their prices by 30%, but this only happened after we had paid the higher prices on this large purchase, and with expensive funding costs adding to the pain. I also took my eye off the ball. Since I had moved my office from Golders Green to working full-time in Soho, my attention was no longer on the camera floor, and simply the quality of our rental service began to suffer. Our clients noticed this, but I was blissfully unaware. While I was still successfully winning new business, our camera floor team would let us down. Equipment wasn't well presented, cables would be missing, filters would be scratched, and our test facilities were poor. The result was that quite quickly we stopped winning repeat business and started losing orders to our competitors. In addition, the spectre of rising costs loomed once more, with the company now servicing both a North West London operation, fully staffed Soho showroom, and a separate post-production division in West London. Worse still, the company could not easily afford to pay the high lease repayments of the latest purchase tranche, which now looked to be uncompetitively expensive. HD camera equipment was now providing almost a third of annual turnover, so we could not afford to give the equipment back either, and uncertainty loomed once more. Our competitors had caught up with us and were simply doing a better job. It was a really sad time in the company's history as we struggled to hold on to our clients. The solution was to increase the quality of our staff and the quality of our rental services at the same time as reducing our costs. This would be a difficult trick to pull off. Chapter 22. Green Shoots. This was a really stressful time for all of us, and the relationship between my parents and I became even more fractious than usual. Jay, our most loyal driver who joined VMI in 2005 and is still with us today, recalls that when taking Mum and Dad to Soho to attend a meeting with me, he would ask Dad in a playful way to make sure that he behaved nicely. Dad would sometimes call him just a short time later after he had exploded with anger at me and ask Jay to collect him again. On the 8th of November 2006, we faced such a severe cash flow crisis that once again we found ourselves on the brink of insolvency, and urgent and decisive action was required. Annual revenues had dropped to pre-2000 levels, and there was now no possibility that we could afford to pay the really expensive leases which had been previously agreed, and we were already £57,000 in arrears. Although it seemed that I had always been looking at cost-saving measures for the company, I now needed to attack costs even more savagely and to do this fast, or else we could expect a visit from the bailiffs who would impound our equipment and we would close for good. In order to survive, I estimated that we had to cut 20% from our costs any way that we could. We returned whatever cars we could to the leasing companies, sold any equipment that we felt we could do without, and shed whatever staff we felt were not essential for the business as it was now. Mum and I refinanced all of our leasing agreements, including the heavily deferred lease agreement, to ensure that our cash flow break-even was at a much more realistic level that the business could sustain. But this wasn't enough, so all 3 directors were forced to take substantial pay cuts in order to balance the books. Since my parents' combined income was much more than I earned at the time, Cheryl and I really suffered, though more on this later. About this time, BBC Radio 4 ran a weekly radio programme where they would interview clever people in difficult industries like climatology and ask them challenging questions which they knew couldn't easily be answered, such as, why can't they predict the weather a year ahead? The programme was called, If You're So Clever, Why Aren't You Rich? And I kept wondering to myself how a clever guy like me could have got it so very wrong. It was clear to me by now that we didn't have the right skills to run a cine camera rental company. We'd entered this industry from the low-end wedding sector, and now our clients shot commercials and film productions and expected a higher level of service from us than we were used to providing. With rare exception, our technicians didn't have the right backgrounds either, so we needed to bring in some new expertise. In June 2006, Kevin joined VMI. He had had the perfect film background lacking in all of us, and had previously worked in and trained at the best companies in our industry. He joined us after his previous company had gone bust, and where he had held the position of technical director. Interestingly, this was the same company that had offered to buy us 7 years before. Kevin recalls that he had been asked to attend 6 separate interviews with Dad, but he wasn't convinced that we needed him. Surprisingly, some months later, Dad still didn't think that Kevin was right for the company, and we used to have many arguments about this. He would shake his head disparagingly and utter that, Kevin just isn't right, you know. It made me really cross too, since I realised that Kevin had such valuable expertise and we needed his help extremely badly. To begin with, since Kevin worked out of Golders Green and I out of Soho, we didn't work together or even meet for some time. Kevin recalls not even being aware that I was particularly important to the company, and just thought that I was the son of the founders who perhaps played in Soho as a sort of vocation. Kevin had some really good ideas of how he could improve our service, and some of these were at little or no cost to us, such as helping with training, which would increase the standards of prep and knowledge. Others, though, were expensive, like replacing all of our flight cases. Mum made it really clear to him that there was literally no money available for initiatives, so he did what he could with a very limited budget. The truth was, VMI was flat broke. After 6 struggling years, my parents were not receptive to spending money in order to increase the standards of our service, but I was, and slowly we made progress and our clients noticed it. Steadily, business improved, and whilst VMI was to post the 6th annual loss in a row, we could finally see a way out of our predicament for the first time in a very long while. By the end of 2006, revenue was up and our clients were happier, Staff morale had improved too, costs were under control, and our cash flow was positive for the first time in some years. VMI was finally on the road to recovery. Then in December 2006, VMI suffered its worst burglary of all time, and we would later find out that we were also not insured. Chapter 23. Working from Home. These days, I work from home 4 days a week, aided by an excellent fibre optic internet connection and dedicated hardware, but it hasn't always been like this. To begin with, people thought me mad for even trying. It had always been a plan of mine that when we moved to Kent I would work mostly from home, but back in 2000, forget about fibre, broadband or ADSL to connect to the internet, we had to use dial-up, and this meant making a phone call just to connect to the internet. Of course, it also meant that I needed to make another phone call if I wanted to speak to anyone in the office as well, so working from home was both unproductive, frustrating and hard. I persevered as I wanted it to improve and didn't give up until I was happy. VMI's first computer system was called Avail, and it was a text-based system which gave the impression that it belonged to the 1980s. But it was fast, and the small packets of data that it used meant that it could work effectively over a dial-up connection. I experimented connecting to the server with a BlackBerry mobile phone and remember being very impressed when it worked. I would often connect to it remotely to continue working on the train home. My first business lines at home used ISDN2, which incorporated 2 separate business telephone lines in one cable. I would usually make 2 simultaneous phone calls when I was working, so one enabled my computer to interface to the server at work, and the other I would use to call the warehouse or the rental desk. Of course, I would also need a third phone line to speak to clients as well, so whilst it sort of worked, it was very slow and unsophisticated. But with the development of the new IT infrastructure in Soho and the arrival of broadband to Kent at about the same time in 2003, working from home became much more practical. For the first time, I was able to configure an extension of my phone system to be at home and avoided diverting calls to my mobile, which made it so much easier than before. A single button on my extension handset allowed me to choose either to receive calls at my home extension or in Soho. My oldest university friend, Mike, had become an IT specialist by this time, and we experimented together to refine our system, since it was not perfect and periodically my calls would prematurely cut off mid-conversation and the phone would go dead, which was really frustrating. We continued to play with floating IP addresses, then fixed IP addresses, and then dedicated hardware VPNs, and each small refinement would make a small but noticeable improvement. Then a new phone system and better internet allowed me to remotely log into my actual phone extension and route my calls in a more sophisticated way than I could do before. And as the internet improved, so did my productivity and the reliability of the system. Today, all who work at VMI's Bristol branch are effectively remote workers, and I've set up home working stations for all of the directors and managers to help them achieve a better work-life balance. Some years ago, I had the idea of building an active desk. Some people use a treadmill, but I like bicycles, so my first version included a recumbent bike, which I fitted onto my desk at home, but the seat was really uncomfortable. I even built one of these setups in the office in London, so that the rental desk could take it in turns to use it and enable them to work and ride for short bursts. Few were as keen as I was to sit on a bike, so it wasn't used very much. Today, I have a full-size stationary bike at my desk, and will work and ride for 90 minutes at a time on an average day, and do this 4 days a week. People say how great it is for me to work from home, and I agree with them. It is great, but perhaps they don't realise just how long it took before it all worked properly. I've found that if you really want something to work which is a bit different to the norm, then persevere. It will be worth it in the end.